Welcome to part 29 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos, which in this case will be covering how to build a Österreichische Army or Austrian army, which can be used for as many sets of rules as possible. When creating a force mix for the very first time, particularly if you lack knowledge of rules, figures or the period, the largest issue is when trying to create your force mix for the first time, what rules and what scale will you use? When starting out, you're often unsure of which set of rules you'll be using. This is especially an issue with scale or figure scale. This can range from a figure representing 50 men to 250 men or even more. Even when you build a force mix for a specific known set of rules, you may wish to try different rules either immediately or later. So how can you build up a force mix which can be used for the widest range of figure scales and rules? After a bit of analysis, I've discovered, or I think, the simplest solution is to create a force mix using a figure scale of 50 men per figure, which means you're basically building up a corps. Rules such as WRG provide you with an army list that allows you to create a corps size formation, and I found these army lists a good guide for what to purchase. If you move to a scale of 150 men per figure, then each unit, which previously would have been a battalion, now becomes a regiment. Or, put another way, your single corps now becomes 3 corps, with all your existing elements divided up by 3, with each representing a corps. So if we look at, let's say, a set of rules that WRG came out back in the 70s, its army lists, which incidentally I think are very good army lists, allows you to create approximately a corps size formation. Now if you moved from a set of rules, let's say WRG which used 1 to 50 scale, to a new set of rules which used 1 to 250 scale, this simply means instead of fielding a single corps, you're now fielding 5 corps, but each corps consists of much less figures. If we're using the WRG Österreichische Army or Austrian Army list as an example, you can field 12 to 24 battalions, with each battalion consisting of 4 elements of 4 figures for each element. This is a total of 48 to 96 elements. If you scale this from 1 to 50 to 1 to 250, this now becomes 10 to 18 elements. Depending on rounding, of course, because we divide our elements by 5, and sometimes you're going to have to round up and you're going to have to round down. If we field 4 to 5 corps, we end up with, guess what, 48 to 96 elements, because we've divided by 5 and now we're multiplying by 5. In most cases, they are the same elements we started with, requiring no purchase of new elements. You can also do the reverse. If we use a DBN army list, each infantry element represents 2,400 men. If we scale down to, let's say, 1,200 men per element, or 300 men per figure, the number of elements are doubled. If we go to WRG scales of 50 men per figures, or 200 men per element, we multiply each element by 12. You do end up with a very coarse grade army list. So while this may work when we go down to a scale of, let's say, between 300 and 150, at 50 men per figure we lose a lot of the detail. At DBN scale it's pretty hard to have rocket artillery, for example. So let's look at the WRG army list. Let's start with the infantry section in the Austrian army lists. The army lists are surprisingly detailed but difficult to understand sometimes. The interesting point is up to 24 battalions of 4 elements could, in theory, be deployed. This makes for a rather large force mix, which would result in a rather long game. On the other hand, this probably would require a lot of raw troops, so they may not actually stick around for long. One point I found rather interesting was just how few cavalry would be deployed, with 3 cavalry regiments allowed. Even if you only used the large 24-figure regiments, this is not a lot of cavalry. The lesson here is that you will not be using much cavalry. It's mainly infantry. I wish I understood this when I purchased all my lancers. I will never ever be able to use all my lancers. On the other hand, my Landwehr is constantly being used. This is in my Prussian army. Artillery is rather complex in WRG. I feel probably unnecessarily complex, but if you read this carefully, you will get the information you need from it. The interesting point is the addition of rocket troops, which was deployed in 1812 and not really available earlier. This comes up with a key issue of the WRG list. They span the entire Napoleonic Wars from at least 1800, if not before, to 1815. Players will need to understand rockets were not available in 1809 and Freikorps not used in the later period of the war, at least on main battlefields. There is one other issue with the WRG army list, and that is the way artillery is described. It's normally described, rather than the actual artillery, as light, and medium, etc. In some cases, not many, but in some cases it makes no sense, and unfortunately it certainly does not make much sense with the Austrian army list. The Austrian foot artillery is described as medium, yet was historically 6-pounders. 6-pounders would have placed them into the light medium category. The Austrians did field 12-pounders, but these would be classed as heavy, which is correctly described in the lists. Now, these could have been light 12-pounders, but the Austrians had almost none of these, so I suspect this may have been an error. I cannot identify the logic, so players may need to replace this with the actual artillery being used, which in this case was 6-pounders and 12-pounders, and then when they apply it to their other sets of rules, look for the artillery types in the other sets of rules, and that way you'll probably get the correct artillery when scaling up or scaling down. The horse artillery is correct, as it was 6-pounder. One interesting point is the levy status for the horse artillery, which I expect is used to reflect their low efficiency compared with French horse artillery. Players may need to be aware of this when converting into another set of rules, because I'm not quite sure if levy means the same in WRG as, let's say, another set of rules. And taking the values from the WRG army list, I inserted them into my army list spreadsheet, which allows me to display the army in any figure scale I wish. In this case, I'm using one figure being equal to 250 men. What you see here is the result, with each corps representing a number of elements, 1/5 that of the WRG army list element total. In this case, I inserted a limit of 3 corps, which is the 3 that you see against the infantry, cavalry and artillery section. I do this because at this scale I normally play on a playing area which is 90 centimetres wide, or 3 feet, by 2 feet deep, or 60 centimetres. And with this size playing area, I prefer force mixes of 36 to 42 figures maximum per side. But if you have a larger playing area, then you would deploy 5 corps, or basically any number you wish. At this scale, you may consider army level units such as heavy artillery, but this is really not required, and I choose not to do so. Regardless, the WRG army list actually inserts army level artillery in the artillery section as an optional thing that you can select. If we drill into the army list in more detail, in this case the infantry section, we can deploy 10 to 19 infantry elements per corps. I normally prefer 10 infantry elements, as I also wish to deploy 2 cavalry and 2 artillery, giving me a total of 14 elements, not including a commander, which is a good size for a corps at this scale. You can multiply this as you wish, based on the size of the playing area. That is, you can have either larger corps or you're going to have more corps. And just for completeness, I will show you a blown up version of the cavalry and artillery section. As you can see here, 2 elements of cav and 2 of artillery is a good choice, although you can have a little bit more cavalry if you so desire. If I went for a maximum of 4 cavalry and 2 artillery with a minimum of 10 infantry, your corps is 16 elements in size. This is still a very cavalry heavy corps and reasonably large, and I prefer 2 cavalry maximum. Once again, you see how little cavalry is actually present in a typical Napoleonic army. Just a quick note, at Marengo the Austrians did have fairly heavy cavalry-heavy formations. You can actually go the other way. This is an example of the 3 army lists provided for the Austrians in DBN. This army list could possibly be used for, let's say, a set of rules which uses a figure scale of 1 in 250, which means each element is 1,000. As each line infantry here represents, let's say, 2,500, you can do your own maths. Basically, you need to double and a little bit, and you've got your army list for your 1 in 250. Unfortunately, if you want to go all the way to a set of army lists which uses a scale of 1 in 50 for infantry figures, then you're talking about elements of 200, which means you need to multiply all this stuff by 12. So, your 12 musketeers become 144 musketeers. Maybe that's correct, but you certainly do not get all that fine greying that you would expect if you're going to a set of rules that use a scale of 1 in 50. The one interesting point about this list is the way the Austrians are divided into 3 periods. I would probably divide it into 4 periods, splitting 1809 from 1812. There is not much difference, but there is some. Rockets, for example, were introduced in 1812, and this is probably the most obvious difference. Infantry mix changes between 1800 and 1815, as you can see here, with 1800 containing more trained line infantry and 1815 containing a higher proportion of lower value infantry, Landwehr in this case, and incidentally Austrian Landwehr were not the same as Prussian Landwehr, they're just simply lower quality line infantry. Cavalry density also changed, with cavalry numbers decreasing between 1800 and 1815, mainly I suppose because infantry numbers grew so much. The lack of battalion guns in 1812 is another simple example of the difference between 1809 and 1812. Using DBN in conjunction with the WRG army list, this is a possible breakdown by the 4 periods that I've mentioned of the Austrian army. So, if you're using WRG army lists as your base point, as you can see at the top, which is called standard, you simply adjust it accordingly based on what you saw in DBN to reflect something that was possibly a little bit more accurate for that specific period. Now, it's not as much an issue as the micro armor world, but it's probably best to match force periods or force mixes by period to give you a better feeling for the problems the real commanders faced. The classic example is in 1800 the Austrians had a lot more artillery and a lot more cavalry than infantry compared with, let's say, 1809. And, unless the army list or unless you know about this, you're not going to be building up your force mix accordingly. Of course, if you're recreating a historical conflict, then just use the historical army list and, make guesses concerning the quality of each of the formations. There is another method of creating army lists, which several rules actually use, and that is to determine what the total force mix of a nation is, and then base your forces from this. This is from a free set of rules, a Garde du Corps, which incidentally can be downloaded by anyone. I don't have the link here, but just simply search for it and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. Here the rules designer has listed all troop types and created or broken them up into 5 columns, one for each major period for the Austrians. They've covered pretty much every army and there's an enormous amount of work in here. Now I'll be honest, I haven't verified this for historical accuracy. It seems reasonably accurate, but I'm sure that if you drill down you'll find some minor, errors. But really, we're not really looking at, getting everything 100% right. Let's not try and be perfect, and let's just try and be good, so to speak. The values shown here are initially rather confusing, so to assist in understanding the values, let's look at the German line before 1805. There are 30 or more German line units, which consist of 18 figures each. The scale of these rules is 50 men for each figure, or 1 to 50, so the unit represents a total of 900 men, which must represent a battalion. It is unclear if my assumption is correct, but 900 is far too low for a regiment in 1800, although at Marengo some regiments approach this strength after fighting for several months. The next value, which is 5D, represents skill, which is the 5, and morale, which is the D. Skill ranges from 1 to 10, so 5 is about the middle, so this could be regarded as trained. Morale ranges from A to G, so D is in the centre of the range, so I also assume must be trained. Now, I find these lists reasonably useful, but you do need to be able to understand the numbers and interpret them in order to make it useful as an army list. And as they're presented here, I don't actually think this makes for a good army list, because you're really forming a corps, and just how much of each of these troops actually is supposed to be in a corps. Now, we can use this army list to give us a proportionate, like for example Hungarian line, which happens to be E, which I suppose is raw, compared to German line, which is D, which is trained. We can get a kind of a breakdown of the proportions of raw and trained. So, we look at the two columns, go across the period, we can see everything is reasonably constant, but in 1815 there is a reasonable change. That is, both groups are about the same. Now, there is an issue with this. Most of the Hungarian formations stayed in Hungary, or close by anyway. So unless you were fighting the Ottomans, you would probably not include as many Hungarian line in your army list than you would otherwise do. This comparison is more useful and shows the rapid rise in Landwehr, which, just to note, is not like the Prussian Landwehr, being closer to a border or home army which was designed to protect a part of the country, but was in other respects regular army. The equipment, training skills and troop quality was lower, so they could be regarded as low quality line infantry. But all this looking for interesting patterns requires a great deal of knowledge in the subject, which, as a new gamer, I'm assuming will not be the case. As a result, I would only recommend this type of analysis once you get to know the history of the force mix you've selected and you really understand the numbers being presented to you. Surprise, surprise, as I do have knowledge of the Austrian army and understand the numbers presented here, I have conducted an analysis of the data in order to allow me to create an army list by period using this dataset. A typical WRG force mix totals about 72 infantry elements. This represents 18 units of 4 elements, which is the midway point between 12 units and 24 units stipulated in the WRG army list. This totals 72 infantry elements, which is a bit large as a force mix for a game, but for our exercise it is what I shall use. I have tried other values and found this the best from this analysis. I then totaled all the infantry bases in the Garde du Corps army list and divided by 72, which gives me a value of 628 depending on the period. This represents the number of WRG size corps the Austrians possess during one of the periods shown in this slide. I now divide all the Garde du Corps values by 628 depending on the period, which gives me a WRG compatible army list. This shows the results of our calculation. Looking at the 1794 to 1804 column, we see our force mix allows us to have 22 elements of German line infantry, or trained line infantry. If we go down to dragoons, we get 6 elements. The WRG list provides greater variability, which is specifically in this case 12 to 24 elements of trained line infantry. So the values shown here would need to range from -1/3 to +1/3. Thus our dragoon value of 6 would range from 4 to 8, for example. The lower value is only important if we want a minimum value, which would not apply to the cavalry, but would apply to the main infantry selections. Thus, in this example, the infantry range for trained line infantry would be 14 to 36 elements, which is a bit higher than the WRG 12 to 24 elements. However, if we go to the 1809 column, the range becomes 12 to 22, which is amazingly close to the WRG values, and my guess is the WRG army list is designed to provide you with a 1809 force mix. There is one issue with this chart, and that is the artillery values are rather high, as WRG would normally allow you to field a maximum of 24 artillery elements. This assumes you are fielding the maximum possible number of infantry elements. The 6-pounder value is correct, as 14 is not far off a maximum of 12, but the 3-pounder value is an issue. My solution was to divide the 3-pounder battalion guns by 2. This is not perfect, but what I'm looking at is trends, and I'm not attempting to achieve the perfect, I'm just attempting to achieve the good. But as indicated before, this is something you do once you have your force mix together and have a lot of knowledge of the army and the period. It does not assist you to start out. The last thing you want to do is purchase 23 elements of 3-pounders to only find no reasonable army list allows you to field that number of 3-pounders. Now, so far I've covered lots of analytics. My general advice is go to the WRG army list, look at that and build your army based on it. You're probably not going to go wrong, but there is another way of creating an army list, and that is pick a battle and use that force mix. This is a possible example using a figure scale of 1 in 250 and 1 in 16 for artillery. Now, the reason why this may not be so good if your scale is 1 in 50 is that you're going to have to pick a corps that is approximately the right number of elements. But, you know, if you're going to pick a scale of 1 in 250, for example, where you can basically deploy the entire Austrian army in Marengo in 1800, then yeah, you can basically look at the army lists, convert it to elements, and there's your force mix. This is a graphical description of what the Austrian force would look like in elements using a scale of 1 in 250. Now, just quite note, okay, this is 1 in 250, this does not apply to WRG, but remember what I said, this is the entire army. If we basically assume this is a corps, which is, let's say, 1/5 the size, then this could also be a force mix that is applicable for WRG, with the army commander no longer being an army commander, being a corps commander, and each of the corps commanders becoming, let's say, divisional commanders. Now, obviously, you're going to have to adjust things here, because basically what we've got here is the Austrian army at Marengo was basically consisted of an enormous centre force wing, which was under the command of Melis with assistance from one of his sub-commanders. So you kind of have an enormous corps, and the other 3 corps are quite small. You're not going to do that within a corps. You're probably going to divide this up a little bit more evenly, so to speak. But this is, one way of you to create an army list. Now, the only issue with this is that you've selected a force mix for, let's say, Austria in 1800, and that may not be the force mix that Austria used in 1809. I can assure you it's not. And it's, as a result, it's probably not a good starting point, because, when you're starting, you probably don't even know what rules you want. You certainly probably don't particularly know what period you're considering, even if you know the nationality you're selecting. So when you start, you need to start with maximum flexibility. But nonetheless, if you're absolutely dedicated to refight Marengo for the rest of your life, then go ahead and recreate the Austrian army at Marengo and hope that you can find a French player that has the French army at Marengo. Well, look, we've been talking about army lists for quite a while here, and you may be thinking, my God, this is all so complex, why should I even bother with army lists? Why not just simply go ad hoc? Okay, look, if you're creating a historical conflict, there's no need for army lists. You just basically find the conflict, get the army list, do a bit of play testing, and hey presto, you've got your battle. But it does require a lot of effort in order to get to the point where you start moving elements around. Army lists are useful when you want to create an ad hoc game very quickly using points. Or alternatively, if you want a points-based game because you want to determine, who's better than the other. Basically, you want a game with a default victory conditions and a force mix that fits those default victory conditions, where you can basically swap in and swap out armies as you so desire and create a game really quickly without doing lots of playtesting and research up front. You don't need to do historical research, you don't have to worry about historical orders of battle, playtesting. You just simply count up your points, deploy your forces, and using the standard victory conditions for whatever that force mix has to be based on points, just have your game. It's a quick way of starting a game. Now, of course, it's not all rosy in the points-based game area, unless your rules are element maneuver rules, such as DBN or even the WRG sets of rules. What kind of force mixes do you have? Most people start with meeting engagements with equal sizes, and I can tell you, if your rules are not element maneuver rules, so you don't end up with a chess-like game, then the game ends pretty boring. you need to have unequal forces to force something to occur with those kind of rules. That is the non-element maneuver rules. One option I'm experimenting with concerning Napoleonic scenarios, and it's based on my micro-armour scenario generation experience, is basically you have equal force mixes, but one side is declared the attacker, which fields all their forces. The other side is nominated the defender, which only fields 75% of forces, and the remaining 25% of the forces arriving at the halfway point of your game, making sure that your game does not last any more than 12 game turns. Now, the defender starts fully deployed on the playing area. The attacker is not on the playing area. An objective on the attacker side and an objective on the defender side is selected. In some cases you have three, an attacker, defender and something in the middle as well. It's entirely up to you. If the attacker gets both of the objectives or all the objectives before the reinforcements arrive, the attacker wins. If not, then the first player to gain two objectives or all objectives out of wins automatically, and if they end up with 2 out of 3, they get some minor level of victory. During the game, a force mix can be forced to retreat if casualties are high enough. So, there is also a trigger for, okay, I've suffered too much, my guys, disappeared. So you still have that, but you would probably or hope to expect most of your games to last the entire 12 game turns with no one retreating off, and based probably on the objective control. That really forces people to do stuff. The attacker has to attack. The defender has to counterattack. If the attacker decides not to attack and just mucks around shooting here and there, automatic loss. And the same with the defender. Look, there are many other variations on this idea. You can change the force mix, you can change when the reinforcements occurs, etc. But, based on this, uneven force mixes at the front start, so one side can attack and has a chance of succeeding, and base victory on objectives. So there's some geographic location on the playing area which has to be taken in order to win, or, if you lose, or if you don't achieve it, you lose. This forces people to move figures on the playing areas. The amount of WRG games that I've had where the two forces set up and look at each other and the artillery pop a few shots hoping to get a reaction test for the cavalry to inadvertently charge to their doom, and that ends up being a game. This is not a particularly exciting game. Of course, this does depend on the rules. WRG probably would have difficulty with this kind of scenario structure because it's not a really very fluid set of rules. And DBN doesn't need this sort of scenario structure because it's very much an element maneuver game where basically you win or lose based on the way you pivot your elements and apply them, etc. And that's a good game, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's a different type of game. So, comes to a close my part 29 of my player idea video series, in this case how to create a Austrian Napoleonic army, in this case using WRG army lists, and also a lot of philosophic questions on where you should get your army list from, how you should use it, and a little bit around scenarios, and I certainly hope it's been useful. Denken Sie daran, immer für Hill heimatlen zu kämpfen.